So for the sake of brevity, let me turn you to Matthew 22 real quick. Here's a good way for us to think about making sure your motive is pleasing to God. Matthew chapter 22, drop down almost to the bottom of this section of Scripture, almost to the bottom of this chapter. And it says, when the Pharisees heard that he, that's Christ, Matthew 22:34, had silenced the Sadducees. Now the Sadducees, kind of like Democrats and Republicans, we had, the more liberal branch, we had the conservative branch, you had two different, I'm not meaning to get political, but I'm just saying that's what it was like. And here the conservatives said, well, he just took care of he just whooped up on the liberals. So they go, we need to see, we can get him on our side. They gathered together. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus said, he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Okay. And this is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. It's also great, right? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all of the law and the prophets. Right? All the moral laws that are found in the Mosaic law and all the moral laws found throughout the prophets. You can hang it on this. Right? If you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and you love your neighbor as much as you love yourself, right? All of a sudden now, you have the summation of all the rules. So, as I'm dealing with other people, if I'm going to say, I want to make sure my motive is praiseworthy, how is God going to look at me and pat me on the head for doing the right thing with you? He's going to say, did you seek to please me? And I'm going to say, I sought to please you. Then he's going to say, then I know that your goal was to love them, right? That has to be the goal. And here's the problem. It's hard for us to love when all of a sudden now people are trying to form groups and they're saying things about me, or there's confusion, or there's conflict, or there's misunderstanding. It's hard, but we have to keep this anchored as the purpose of my whole life as I relate to other people. I want to love you. Right now, love's not going to be defined on the 70s channel on your XM radio. It's not, you don't define love by watching your rom-coms or watching the Hallmark channel. That's not how love is defined. Love is defined, right, by the first verse you ever learned as a kid at church. For God so loved the world that he, now here's a verb that's a little bit cleaned up here, sanitized, gave. He gave his only son. Now you know what that means, right? It means that he just eventually strung up naked on a cross, bleeding, being whipped, having spikes through his hands and his feet, with a crown of thorns that they were mocking him over, a crown as though he's some king, dying like a criminal between two criminals. That was how he gave his son as a human sacrifice. That's not what you're learning about love on pop music or on movies. That's not good feelings. That is, to sum it up well, let me just quote from Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. That's the second person of the Godhead who exists in the form of God, all the equality and the divine attributes of God. He has it all. And he's willing to lay that aside, right? Doesn't mean he stops being God. But the independent actions within the Godhead, the attributes are now subjected to the Father. And he says, now I'm not going to independently exercise my divine attributes. I'm going to be found like a human being, like an ant, so to speak, as we say to the kids in Sunday school. And he becomes a human. And not only a human, he becomes one of the most detested humans, as it was predicted in Isaiah. And he would be one from whom men hide their faces. And he would become the person that all the angst of the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the scribes and all the Roman officials would eventually string him up on a cross. He became obedient even to the point of death, even death on a cross. Okay, now, it'd be much better for him to stay, in the living room of heaven watching, Netflix or whatever, right? Think about this. All the angels adoring him, all the attributes fully here, intact, exercisable independently as the second person of the Godhead, right? In unity with the rest of the members of the Godhead. You could see this as much more comfortable than walking around and being mocked and accused and eventually murdered. And yet he lays that aside. Why? To redeem us. So he goes to great lengths to redeem us. And all of this in chapter 2 of Philippians, which is a great Christological passage, is nothing more than a theological motivation to do what he says in verse 4. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, he says, you ought to be not looking out for your own interests only. You should be looking out for the interests of others. You should do nothing from selfishness or vain conceit. You ought to be willing to put others' interests before you. You want a good definition of love? John 3:16, right? He gave his son. What does that mean? Like Jesus said, no greater love is anyone than this, that you'd lay down your life for your friends. I become a willing sacrifice. I will go through pain so that you can be advantaged. I'll put your needs before my own. I'll put your interest above my own. Now, the only way we can think rightly about my motive to love you is to make sure I get the first commandment above the second. I've got to love God with all my heart, soul, and mind. I've got to be able to say everything about loving you has got to be defined by what it means to love him. In other words, God gets to define what it is to love you. And that means your interests need to be responded to, right, in a way that God is going to be pleased with. That's why it's praiseworthy, not by people. Your motive needs to be praiseworthy to God. So I want you to love people so that all the people in your small group, all your neighbors that you have problems with, all the people at the office that you struggle with, whatever's going on, all the office drama, that you would say, my job is to love these people, whether they're Christians or non-Christians, but particularly within the church. That's the context of our passage. There's always this going on in the church because these are our closest relationships, or at least they should be. And there's going to be conflict. And what we should say is, God, I want you to look at my motive to know that I, out of love for you, am loving them. And my love for them means that I'm nice to them when I feel good. It's that I'm putting their interests first, that I care about their well-being, that I want to do what is good for them in light of all that God says is good. He's got to define the good, but I'm going to be good to them. Okay, that is a superior motive that the world does not have. It's hard for us even to naturally have it. We don't naturally have it unless there's feelings involved, and that's called romantic love, and that's different, but this kind of love is even better. This is hard to do, but it's the best motive. It's the motive God will one day praise you for.